The blood on my laptop case was still warm when I realized my father wasn't just lying to me. He was killing my mother. I was standing in a rainy alley in Manhattan, clutching a thumb drive that proved the Sterling Foundation was a front for something much darker than simple greed. But here's the part that will make your skin crawl. In exactly 96 hours, my father is moving my mother to a private facility in Switzerland. If she gets on that plane, she disappears forever. I thought I was the hero of this story, the whistleblower risking everything to expose a massive financial fraud. I didn't know that the woman my father called his mistress was actually the one pulling the strings. I didn't know that every dollar I was trying to trace was the only thing keeping my mother's heart beating. They've frozen my bank accounts, and they've issued a warrant for my arrest. If I tell the truth, my mother dies. If I stay silent, I become a monster. Let me take you back to the night the alarm started screaming. The heavy glass doors of the Sterling Heart Foundation yielded with a hushed hiss. Julian Sterling pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner, the green LED casting a sickly glow across his knuckles. Silence saturated the lobby, smelling of expensive floor wax and filtered air. Every footfall on the polished marble echoed like a heartbeat through the cavernous atrium. He bypassed the elevators, preferring the stairwell where the air tasted dry and of concrete. On the 42nd floor, the executive suite lay draped in shadows. Julian slipped into his office, the mahogany desk a dark island in the gloom. He didn't reach for the light switch. Instead, the blue radiance of his monitor sliced through the dark as he swiped his keycard. The cooling fans whirred to life, a low industrial drone that vibrated through his fingertips. He inserted the drive, a weighted piece of brushed aluminum, and watched the progress bar crawl across the screen. Each percentage point felt like a physical weight. Outside, the city lights flickered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, thousands of unsuspecting lives pulsing in the grid below. He clicked the silver-plated coin in his pocket against his teeth. Click, 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 exactly 4 times. The rhythmic metal on enamel was the only thing that steadied his hands. The math was clear, but the risk was a jagged edge. He was hunting for the digital ghost of his father's sins, pulling the thread of a multi-million-dollar lie that funded his mother's hospital bed. The screen flickered with rows of raw data. Julian's eyes scanned the ledgers, looking for the delta between the public donations and the private expenditures. He found the anomaly buried in a subdirectory labeled Maintenance Sub-Level 4. It wasn't maintenance. It was a conduit. Millions of dollars, earmarked for pediatric wings and cardiac research, rerouted into offshore accounts with names he didn't recognize. He clicked Download. The drive blinked red, pulsing like an open wound as it swallowed the evidence of his father's legacy. He gripped the edge of the desk, his skin slick against the wood. As the file transfer reached completion, a floorboard groaned in the hallway. Julian froze, his breath hitching in his throat. He stared at the door handle, waiting for it to turn. The sound didn't repeat, but the silence that followed was heavier, more predatory. He yanked the drive from the port and tucked it into his inner blazer pocket. The metal felt cold against his ribs. He needed to move. The building was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage of glass and steel, and the hunters were waking up. He slipped out of his office, his back hugging the wall. The hallway was a tunnel of gray shadows. At the end of the corridor, the elevator lobby glowed with a soft, amber light. A figure stood there, hand jammed into the gap between the closing doors. It was Bill Miller. The old archivist looked like a piece of crumpled parchment in his oversized suit, his face etched with a permanent scowl. He was gripping the heavy brass key that hung around his neck, his knuckles white. "You're late, kid," Bill hissed, his voice a dry rasp that barely carried over the hum of the air conditioning. Security just finished their sweep of the lobby. They're heading for the service lift. Move. Julian didn't argue. He lunged for the elevator, his shoes squeaking on the polished floor. As the doors hissed shut, he felt the vibration of the car descending. Bill didn't look at him. The old man just stared at the floor indicator, his thumb rubbing the brass key. "The stairs are blocked," Bill muttered. "Davis is on a tear tonight. He's counting steps again. If you hear him whispering numbers, you're already dead." The elevator chimed, a bright, artificial sound that felt like a gunshot in the quiet. They weren't at the lobby. The car had stopped at the 35th floor. The doors slid open to reveal a yawning, dark stairwell. "Go," Bill commanded, shoving Julian toward the opening. "I'll take the car to the basement. Give them a ghost to chase." Julian stumbled into the concrete stairwell, the door clicking shut behind him. The air here was colder, smelling of dust and stagnant breath. He began to descend, his hand sliding along the cold iron railing. He was 3 flights down when he heard it. 1, 2, 3, 4. A low, rhythmic whispering echoed from below. It was Richard Davis. Julian stopped, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could hear the heavy thud of combat boots on concrete. The sound was methodical, precise. Davis wasn't just patrolling. He was clearing the space with military efficiency. Julian looked up. Returning to the 35th floor was a death sentence. The electronic lock would have engaged. He looked down into the darkness. The whispering grew louder. 7, 8, 9. He had to fight. There was no other exit. Julian reached into his laptop bag and gripped the heavy, reinforced case. It was a blunt instrument, but it was all he had. He tucked his chin, centered his weight, and waited. As the silhouette of the burly guard rounded the landing, Julian didn't hesitate. He lunged. The collision was violent. Julian swung the laptop case with every ounce of desperation he possessed. The heavy edge caught Davis across the temple with a sickening thud. The guard grunted, his head snapping back, but he didn't go down. He was a wall of muscle, his suit jacket straining at the shoulders. Davis lunged forward, a wild punch whistling past Julian's ear and cracking against the concrete wall. The vibration of the impact shivered through the floor. Julian ducked low, feeling the rush of air as a second blow narrowly missed him. He shoved his shoulder into the guard's chest, using the man's own momentum against him. They grappled in the narrow space, the smell of Davis's peppermint gum and gun oil filling Julian's senses. Julian found a foothold on the edge of a step and shoved with everything he had. Davis lost his balance, his boots scuffing the concrete. With a final, desperate heave, Julian sent the man tumbling backward down the flight of stairs. The sound of the fall was a series of heavy, metallic crashes as Davis's gear hit the railings. Julian didn't wait to see if he stayed down. He turned and bolted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He hit the ground floor fire exit, the alarm's wail suddenly erupting, vibrating through the soles of his shoes. He burst out into the Manhattan night. The rain was a cold, relentless sheet that blurred the neon signs of Midtown. Julian ran, his lungs burning. He didn't look back at the towering glass monolith of the foundation. He disappeared into the sea of yellow taxis and umbrellas, the weight of the thumb drive in his pocket feeling like a live coal. He didn't stop until he reached the safe house, a hollow, furnished apartment in a neighborhood where no one asked questions. The room smelled of nothing, a sterile void that offered a temporary illusion of safety. A flickering street lamp outside strobed orange light across the floor every 4 seconds. Julian sat at the small wooden table, his hands shaking as he opened his laptop. He needed to see what he had killed for. Subverted beat 1.4. Julian felt a surge of professional confidence as he began the decryption process. He was an analyst. This was his domain. He had spent years learning how his father, Arthur, hid money. He knew the patterns, the fake charities, the inflated shipping costs, the ghost employees. He assumed this drive held the final proof of Arthur's slush fund, the money used to keep a mistress named Sarah Johnson in a life of luxury, while his mother, Eleanor, withered in a hospital bed. The logic was sound. Sarah was always there, a shadow in the background of foundation galas, dressed in soft pastels, offering kind words that never quite reached her eyes. It was a classic trope, the powerful man and his secret second life. Julian's fingers flew across the keys, bypassing the secondary security layers with the ease of a man who had designed half the systems he was now breaking. Click, 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 click. He tapped the coin against his teeth. The progress bar hit 100%. He felt a wave of grim satisfaction. He was about to dismantle his father's world. The files opened. He expected to see jewelry receipts, apartment leases, and private jet manifests in Sarah's name. He expected to see Arthur's signature on every authorization. The relief began to wash over him, a physical loosening of the knots in his shoulders. He had him. He had the leverage to force his father to give Eleanor the care she deserved. But as he scrolled through the board meeting minutes and the wire transfer authorizations, his brow furrowed. The relief curdled into a cold, prickling unease. Arthur's signature wasn't on the final approval. In fact, Arthur had been systematically cut out of the financial loop for the last 18 months. Julian stopped. He noticed a detail that didn't fit, a series of digital stamps from a high-level administrative key. He tracked the key back to its source. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Sarah Johnson wasn't a mistress being taken care of. She was the one holding the leash. The slush fund wasn't a personal account. It was the Foundation's primary operating nerve center, and Sarah was the sole signatory. She wasn't a recipient of the fraud. She was the architect. She sat on the board not as a figurehead, but as the secret majority shareholder of the shell companies that were bleeding the Foundation dry. Julian hadn't just found evidence against his father. He had stumbled into a trap far larger than a family scandal. He had handed himself over to a woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of being invisible, while she dismantled the Sterling legacy from the inside. He wasn't the hunter anymore. He was the prey who had just walked into the center of the web. The weight of the discovery hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. He leaned back, the cheap plastic chair creaking under his weight. He had spent his life hating his father for a betrayal that was only half the story. The real enemy was the woman who had brought him tea and cookies while he did his homework as a child. The orange strobe of the street lamp continued its rhythmic pulse. 1, 2, 3, 4. Julian stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in his eyes. He had the evidence, but it wasn't a weapon. It was a death warrant. If Sarah knew he had this, she wouldn't just fire him. She would erase him. The next morning, the air in Julian's apartment felt thin, as if the oxygen was being sucked out of the room by the looming presence of his father. Arthur Sterling stood by the window, his silver hair swept back with surgical precision. He didn't look at Julian. He looked at the city he believed he owned. He checked his watch. 7 minutes fast, as always. "Your mother is being moved, Julian," Arthur said, his voice carrying the weight of a gavel. "The facility in Switzerland is the best in the world. High security, total privacy. The Alps will be good for her." Julian felt a surge of panic. "You're isolating her. You're taking her away so I can't see her." Arthur turned, his eyes unblinking, invading Julian's personal space. I am protecting the legacy. Your investigation is a nuisance, son. Stop digging or the transfer becomes permanent. You'll never see her again. Do you understand the math of that? 1 son, 0 mother. Julian's hand went to his pocket, but he didn't click the coin. The threat was a physical weight, a cold hand around his throat. Arthur wasn't just moving her. He was using her as a human shield for the crimes Sarah was committing. Or perhaps Arthur didn't even know. No, Arthur always knew. He just didn't care about the truth as long as the optics remained perfect. The pillars must hold, Julian, Arthur whispered. Leaning in so close, Julian could smell the expensive cedar wood of his cologne. Regardless of the cost, don't be the crack in the foundation. Arthur left, the door clicking shut with a finality that echoed through the empty apartment. Julian knew he had to act fast. He reached out to Robert Thompson, a journalist at the Gazette, who had been sniffing around the foundation for months. They met in a crowded Starbucks, the roar of milk steamers and pop music providing a thin layer of cover. I have it, Robert, Julian said, sliding his laptop across the sticky table. The offshore links, the board minutes, it's all here. Robert looked at the screen, his eyes tired, coffee stains on his rumpled lapel. He pulled a handful of sugar packets from his pocket and began sorting them by date. The crinkle of the paper was the sound of his anxiety. If this is real, Julian, it's the story of the decade. Let me get it onto our secure server. Julian initiated the upload. He felt a glimmer of hope. If the truth was out, Sarah couldn't touch him. The progress bar reached 40%, 50%. Suddenly, the screen flickered. Green. A jagged line of red code slashed across the window. System error. Critical failure. What's happening? Robert asked, his voice rising. Someone's inside, Julian hissed. He tried to kill the connection, but the keyboard was unresponsive. The laptop's cooling fans shrieked, a high-pitched industrial scream. The air began to smell of scorched dust and melting plastic. In seconds, the screen went black. A single line of text appeared in the center. Clean slate. The hard drive groaned, a physical grinding sound of metal on metal, and then went silent. The malware hadn't just stopped the transfer. It had physically destroyed the drive's read head. Julian stared at the dead device. He had nothing. No evidence. No leverage. Only the memory of the numbers. He returned to his apartment, his mind racing. He needed a backup. He needed the physical ledger Bill had mentioned. But when he reached his front door, he stopped. The door was standing wide open. The wood around the lock was splintered, the smell of sawdust fresh in the air. Julian stepped inside, his heart thudding. The living room was a wreck. Books had been ripped from shelves, cushions sliced open. But nothing of value. His watch, his spare cash, had been taken. This wasn't a robbery. It was a message. He ran to the bedroom. "Jennifer?" he called out. Jennifer Wilson, his mother's nurse, was supposed to be there. She was the only person who truly cared for Eleanor, the one who whispered apologies to the door frames. The room was empty. A medicine tray lay overturned on the floor, white pills scattered like teeth across the rug. There were signs of a struggle, a torn curtain, a broken lamp. Jennifer was gone. Julian slumped against the wall, the cold plaster biting into his back. He realized with a sickening clarity that they were widening the circle. They weren't just coming for him. They were erasing everyone he touched. Sarah and Arthur were playing for keeps. He knew he couldn't stay. He took his car and drove, aimlessly at first, then with a growing sense of purpose. He ended up in Greenwich, outside the sprawling estate of Sarah Johnson. The house was a masterpiece of colonial architecture, hidden behind a wall of ancient oaks. It looked peaceful, but Julian knew better. He sat in his car, watching the house through the rain-streaked windshield. He saw a black SUV idling at the end of the driveway. He didn't think. He just reacted. He put the car in gear and pulled away, but the SUV immediately swung out behind him. The chase began in the narrow, winding streets of the residential district. The sound of tires screeching on wet cobblestones echoed off the brick walls. Julian's hands were slick on the wheel. The SUV rammed his rear bumper, a jarring impact that sent his head snapping back. 1, 2, 3. He could almost hear Richard Davis counting the hits. Julian swerved through a red light, the high-pitched friction of his tires screaming in the night. He saw a construction site ahead, a maze of scaffolding and heavy machinery. He didn't slow down. He steered straight for the gap between two towering piles of lumber. The SUV followed, its engine roaring. At the last second, Julian yanked the handbrake and spun his car into a tight 180-degree turn. The SUV driver, blinded by the spray of mud and rain, couldn't react in time. The heavy vehicle slammed into a stack of steel beams with a deafening, metallic roar. Sparks erupted, lighting up the rainy dark like a firework display. Julian didn't wait. He abandoned his car and vanished into the industrial shadows, his boots splashing through deep puddles. He doubled back toward Sarah's house. He didn't want to run anymore. He wanted answers. He broke into the estate through a side window, the smell of rotting peaches, from a bowl of fermenting fruit on the counter, cloying the air. He found Sarah in her private study. She didn't look surprised. She was sitting at a desk, rolling smooth river stones in her palm. Clack, 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 clack. "You're remarkably persistent, Julian," she said, her voice soft and approachable, masking the coldness in her gaze. "I know it's you," Julian rasped, his clothes soaked, his face bruised. "I saw the keys. I saw the signatures. You're the one stealing the money." Sarah smiled, a thin, clinical expression. "Stealing? No, Julian. I'm managing. Your father is a man of grand visions and very little practical sense. He wanted a legacy. I gave him the infrastructure to support it. Do you think the research, the wings, the fame, do you think that's free? It requires a certain flexibility of the ledgers. You're killing my mother to pay for it," Julian said, his voice trembling. Sarah stood up, the stones clicking in her pocket. "Your mother was a casualty of your father's ego long before I arrived. I'm just the one making sure the lights stay on. And now, thanks to your little stunt at the office, the board is very concerned about your mental health." She leaned in, her eyes reflecting the dim light of the desk lamp. "Go home, Julian, before you lose what little you have left." Julian backed away, the smell of the rotting fruit making him nauseous. He realized then that Sarah wasn't just a partner in the crime. She was the engine. Arthur was the face, but she was the heart, cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of mercy. The next few days were a blur of paranoia. Arthur moved fast. Julian's bank accounts were frozen. A private warrant was issued for his arrest, claiming he had suffered a violent psychotic break. He was a ghost in his own city, sleeping in subway stations, his stomach a knot of hunger and fear. He had one card left to play: Bill Miller. He reached Bill's apartment in the dead of night. The building was sharp and jagged, the ceilings low and oppressive. Bill was there, gripping his brass key, his eyes darting to the shadows. "They're looking for you, kid," Bill whispered. "Davis was here. He didn't find anything, but he'll be back. The ledger, Bill. You said you had a physical copy. Bill nodded slowly. He led Julian to his study and pointed to a single square foot of floorboard that had been sanded down until it was raw and splintered. Under there, the exit strategy I never used. Julian pried up the wood. Inside was a heavy, leather-bound book. He opened it, and his breath caught. It wasn't just a list of names. It was a record of every piece of substandard medical equipment purchased by the Foundation, the very equipment keeping his mother alive. The serial numbers matched the monitors in her room. The Foundation wasn't just laundering money. They were profiting from the very illness they claimed to be curing by using cheap, dangerous knockoffs and pocketing the difference. "This is it," Julian whispered. "This is how I stop them." He knew the annual gala at the Waldorf Astoria was the only chance he had. He disguised himself as a waiter, the stiff white shirt feeling like a straitjacket. The ballroom was a chaotic roar of clinking glass and orchestral music. The smell of lilies was overwhelming, thick and sickly like a funeral home. He moved through the crowd, his eyes scanning for Arthur. He found him in a secluded corridor, away from the flashbulbs. But Arthur wasn't alone. He was waiting. Before Julian could speak, Arthur lunged forward with a speed that belied his age. He jammed his heavy, silver-topped cane into Julian's throat, pinning him against the cold marble wall. "You think you're so smart, Julian," Arthur hissed, his face inches from his son's. "You think this is about money? It's about survival. You're killing her, Dad." Julian gasped, the cane cutting off his air. "The equipment, it's all fake." Arthur's grip tightened. "No, Julian. The equipment is functional. It's the medication that matters. The experimental treatment Eleanor is receiving, it's a cocktail of sedatives. It keeps her quiet. It keeps her from telling the world what I did 20 years ago to build this place." Julian's world tilted. His mother wasn't just sick. She was being kept in a chemical prison to protect a secret. "And here is the math you haven't calculated," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a deathly whisper. "If you expose us tonight, the funding for that treatment disappears. The doctors will stop. And without it, her heart, already weakened by the drugs, will fail in minutes. If you win, she dies. By your hand. By your truth." Julian felt his knees go weak. The ledger in his pocket felt like 1,000 pounds of lead. He was trapped in a binary choice with no right answer. Justice for the victims, or the life of his mother. Subverted beat 3.6. Julian stood in the dim light of the corridor, the weight of the leather-bound ledger pressing against his ribs like a physical accusation. He looked at his father's face, the cold, unblinking eyes, the surgical precision of his hair. And for the first time, he saw the logic clearly. He decided to make the smart move. He would play the long game. He wouldn't cause a scene here. He would hand the ledger to Arthur as a gesture of surrender, gain his father's trust, and then use his new position to slowly, secretly switch his mother's medication and move her to a safe location. It was the only rational path. It saved Eleanor and gave him a chance to fight another day. He would be the mole in his own family's empire. "Fine," Julian rasped, his voice breaking. "You win. I'll stop. Just don't hurt her." He pulled the ledger from his jacket and held it out. "Here, the only physical copy. Take it. I'll do whatever you want." Arthur's expression softened. A small, fatherly smile touched his lips. The same smile he'd used when Julian won his first math competition. "I knew you'd see reason, son. You're a Sterling after all. We don't burn the house down, we remodel." Arthur took the ledger, his fingers brushing Julian's hand. He tucked it under his arm and stepped back, his posture relaxing. Go to the holding room backstage. Get cleaned up. I want you on stage with me when I announce the Swiss transfer. We'll show them the Sterling legacy is stronger than ever. Julian felt a wave of profound relief. The crushing weight in his chest eased. He had saved her. He had found a middle ground. He walked toward the backstage area, his mind already calculating the steps to infiltrate the medical supply chain. 1, 2, 3. The crisis was over. He reached the threshold of the holding room and stopped. Something was wrong. He turned back. Arthur wasn't heading toward the ballroom. He was standing by a large decorative fireplace in the corridor. He didn't look like a man who had just reconciled with his son. He looked like a man finishing a chore. Julian watched, frozen, as Arthur tossed the leather-bound ledger into the roaring flames. The ancient paper caught instantly, the edges curling and blackening. "Dad," Julian whispered. Arthur turned, and the warmth was gone. His face was a mask of cold, industrial stone. "You really are your mother's son, Julian. Too much sentiment, not enough foresight." Two security guards, the same ones who had supposedly been searching for Julian, stepped out from behind a velvet curtain. They weren't there to arrest him. They were there to escort him. "The ledger was the only thing I was worried about," Arthur said, adjusting his tie 3 times. "The digital files were already handled. Now that the physical proof is ash, you're just a young man having a very public, very tragic breakdown." Arthur leaned in, his voice a cold hiss. "The treatment isn't just about keeping her quiet anymore, Julian. It's about keeping you compliant. If you ever speak a word of this, I won't just stop her care. I'll tell the world you were the one who tampered with her IV. And with your medical history of mental instability, who do you think they'll believe?" The truth hit Julian like a physical blow. He hadn't bought time. He had handed over his only shield. He was now an accomplice by silence, his mother's life the collateral for his own forced cooperation. He hadn't saved her. He had signed her death warrant and handed the pen to his father. His smart decision had stripped him of his last shred of agency. He was no longer a hunter or a mole. He was a prisoner in a tuxedo. He was shoved into the holding room, the electronic lock clicking shut with a final, mocking sound. The room was small, smelling of stale perfume and floor wax. Julian sat on the floor, his head in his hands. He could hear the muffled roar of the gala through the walls, the laughter, the music, the sound of 1,000 people celebrating a lie. He reached into his pocket and found his silver coin. Click, 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 click. The sound was hollow. The math had failed him. But as he stared at the electronic lock, his analytical mind began to spark. He didn't need a key. He needed a surge. He took his silver-plated cufflink and jammed it into the gap in the lock's housing. A spark erupted, the smell of ozone filling the small room. The lights flickered and died. The door hissed open. He stepped out into the hallway. He didn't run for the exit. He headed for the stage. He reached the wings just as Arthur was being introduced. "And now," the announcer boomed, "to discuss the future of the Sterling Heart Foundation, please welcome our chairman, Arthur Sterling, and his son, Julian." Julian stepped into the light. The glare of 1,000 flashbulbs was blinding, a wall of white heat. He saw his mother in the front row, her face pale and vacant, her frame so frail she seemed made of glass. He walked to the podium. Arthur looked at him, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but he quickly masked it with a professional smile. He leaned in and whispered, "Careful, Julian. Remember the cost." Julian looked at the crowd, the elite of Manhattan, the people who funded the machine. He looked at the tablet on the podium, connected to the ballroom's massive screens. He began to speak. His voice was steady, precise. He praised his father's vision. He spoke of legacy and foundation. Arthur relaxed, his hand resting on Julian's shoulder. But as Julian spoke, his fingers were moving across the tablet. He wasn't opening a speech. He was opening a remote link he had established weeks ago. A ghost in the machine that even Sarah's malware hadn't found. "My father taught me that the truth is a luxury," Julian said into the microphone, his voice echoing through the grand ballroom. "But he also taught me that a foundation is only as strong as its materials." He swiped the screen. Suddenly, the massive displays behind them changed. It wasn't the promotional video of smiling children. It was a live feed of the Foundation's shadow accounts, the ones Sarah thought she had erased. The numbers began to scroll, millions of dollars flowing from the pediatric fund to a series of offshore accounts. And then, the final blow. The procurement records for the substandard medical equipment, side by side with the photos of the failed valves and rusted monitors. The room went silent. The only sound was the rhythmic click, 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 click of Julian's coin against the microphone. Arthur's face turned a sickly gray. He reached for the tablet, but Julian stepped back. "The math is simple, Dad," Julian whispered, his voice carrying through the silent room. "The legacy is over." The fallout was immediate. The flashbulbs turned from celebratory to predatory. Sarah Johnson vanished into the crowd, her riverstones clicking frantically in her pocket. Arthur was led away by federal agents, his 7 minutes fast watch finally running out of time. Months later, Julian sat in a quiet room at a private clinic, a real one, funded by the remnants of the Foundation's legitimate assets. He held Eleanor's hand. She was awake, her eyes clear for the first time in years. The sedatives were gone. She couldn't speak much, but she squeezed his hand. "I'm sorry, Mom," Julian whispered. "I'm so sorry." She smiled, a faint, genuine expression that reached her eyes. She passed away that evening, peacefully, in the golden light of the setting sun. Julian had ensured her dignity. He had given her back her life, even if only for a few weeks. Now, Julian sits in the CEO's office on the 42nd floor. The mahogany desk is a dark island in the gloom. The smell of floor wax and filtered air is the same. He looks at the shadow accounts on his screen, the ones he is now responsible for cleaning up. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out the silver-plated coin. He doesn't click it against his teeth. He sets it on the desk. He realizes that to destroy the machine, he had to become the most efficient part of it. He saved his mother, but he lost the boy who believed in absolute justice. He is the new chairman. He is the one who controls the variables. He looks out at the Manhattan skyline, the thousands of lives pulsing in the grid below. He is the architect now, and the foundation must hold. The end.